Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Electra didn't flash back the exact moment her knees stopped shaking, only that ever she was standing in the middle of the BNB shop, the familiar scent of fabric, broom, and incense wrapping around her like a cruel parody of comfort, bolts of silk and lace blurring as the verity about Will's infidelity reproach eventually finished crashing through her. Because it wasn't just a scuttlebutt presently or a tale passed too vocally between interns and sidekicks who allowed she couldn't. Here, it was verified, inarguable, unattractive in a way that made her casket pang and her cognizance ring, and all she could suppose was how stupidly certain she'd been, how fiercely she'd defended him when Brooke's raised eyebrow dallied a second too long or when Steffi's tone stoned just enough to suggest concern masked as judgment. And now every single bone of those moments replayed in her mind like scenes from a poorly written script she'd starred in without realizing she was the only bone who didn't know the ending, her fritters entwining into the swatch of her bag as if holding on tighter could ever keep the ground from tipping beneath her. And it was also that RJ noticed, because RJ always noticed, indeed when he pretended not to, indeed when he stayed quiet in the background with his sketchbook and his soft eyes that saw further than he ever said. And he crossed the room without vacillation, without asking authorization, his hand swimming near her elbow in that careful way that showed he understood how fragile she was in that moment, how fluently she might shatter if someone touched her wrong. And when Electra eventually looked up at him, really looked, she saw the shock there too, but not the chatty kind that fed on reproach, the deeper kind that came from empathy, from knowing how deeply treason could cut. And that was when it all hit her at formerly, the demotion, the grief, the wrathfulness, the sharp sting of realizing she'd loved someone who had been living a double life while she'd been planning a future, and her breath hitched so hard she allowed she might actually collapse right there between the slice table and the racks of untreated designs, but RJ didn't let her. He stepped closer, near enough that his shoulder brushed hers, resting her, reminding her she was alone indeed if it felt like the whole world had just turned its reverse on her. And when she eventually leaned into him it wasn't dramatic or purposeful. It was instinct, her body seeking safety before her mind could catch up, her forepart resting against his casket as if it had always known that was where she belonged when effects fell piecemeal, and RJ's arms came around her sluggishly, hypercritically, yet with a certainty that made her exhale for the first time since she'd heard Will's name paired with the word infidelity. His hand settling between her shoulder blades, steady and warm as the controlled chaos of the BNB shop continued around them, scissors snipping, voices grunting, life going on as if hers hadn't just cracked wide open, and Electra abominated that part of it the most, that the world didn't stop, that there was no pause button for heartache, no advertisement that said please stand by while she put herself back together, but in RJ's arms the noise dulled, the sharp edges of her pain softened just enough for her to breathe. And she rumored his name like a concession, like in reason, like a plea each at formerly, and he didn't ask her to explain because he formerly knew, everyone knew now. Will's shocking verity splashed across exchanges and defenses with the kind of seductiveness reserved for public downfalls, and RJ felt a quiet fury poach in his casket, not just toward Will but toward the way Electra had been treated like collateral damage in someone differently's mess. And as she spoke in broken rulings about textbooks she'd no way seen, about falsehoods that made her question her own recollections, RJ heated, really heated, his jaw tensing not in judgment of her but in unbelief that anyone could be careless with a heart like hers, and Electra realized as she stood there adhering to him that this was the first time she felt safe enough to be messy, to not package her pain into commodity presentable, to not be the composed, swish woman everyone anticipated her to be at Forrester Creations, and she cried into his shoulder, quiet at first, also harder, the kind of crying that leaves you hollowed out and paining, and RJ held her through all of it, through the shaking, through the angry little laughs that slipped out when she talked about how eyeless she'd been, through the silence that followed when there was nothing left to say but so much left to feel, and nearly in that silence commodity shifted, not in a dramatic, libelous way, but in the subtle way connections change when trust deepens, when comfort becomes connection. Because Electra felt it also, the way RJ's presence wasn't just soothing but familiar, how his twinkle under her observance was steady in a way Will's had no way been, how RJ no way made her feel like she had to earn his fidelity, and she pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes red and raw, searching his face for anything that looked like pity or anticipation, But all she set up was concern and an implied pledge that he wasn't going anywhere, and that consummation hurt. Nearly as important as it healed, because it made her wonder how she hadn't seen him ahead, how she'd been so focused on a love that demanded trust while giving so little of it back that she'd overlooked the quiet strength standing right in front of her, and RJ, for his part, felt the weight of that moment settle over him, apprehensive that this was a line, a delicate one, and he didn't want to cross it recklessly, didn't want to be another man who took advantage of Electra's vulnerability, so he kept his voice low, gentle, telling her she didn't earn what Will had done, that none of it was her fault, words that sounded simple but landed like lifelines because she demanded to hear them from someone who meant them, and as Electra jounced, wiping at her cheeks, she realized that Will's reproach hadn't just pushed her down from him. It had pushed her toward clarity, toward understanding what real support looked like, and standing there in the heart of B&B, girdled by creations meant to tell stories of love and glamour, she felt stripped down to commodity more honest, further real, leaning on RJ not because she was weak but because she eventually allowed herself to be, and when she uncurled her posture, drawing in a shaky breath, RJ didn't let go right down, his hands moping just long enough to remind her she could always come back to that moment if she demanded to, and as they stood side by side facing the rest of the day, the whispers, the questions, the ineluctable fallout of Will's treason, Electra knew nothing was magically fixed, her heart was still bruised, her trust still fragile, but commodity important had changed, because she wasn't facing it alone presently, and whether or not either of them was ready to name what was growing between them, it was there, inarguable, born not out of reproach but out of solace, out of the simple, important act of one person being there when another fell piecemeal, and as Electra took her first step forward, RJ's shoulder brushing hers formerly more, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her casket, that occasionally the most unanticipated trueness come from the most painful exposures, and occasionally a reproach doesn't just end a love story, it rewrites the morning of another. Electra aloud. She was prepared for the fate, for the way Will's reproach would echo through every hallway and meeting room at B&B like a stain no quantum of damage control could completely abolish, but medication was a fantasy people cleaved to when they didn't yet understand how grim public treason could be, because indeed after she pulled herself together and thanked RJ with a small, exhausted smile, indeed after she claimed she could handle the rest of the day on her own, the verity followed her like a shadow, adhering to her heels as she moved through the structure, and RJ stayed near without swimming, a quiet constant in her supplemental vision, near enough that she could feel his presence without feeling smothered by it, and that signified further than she could put into words, because what Will had taken from her wasn't just trust, it was her sense of footing, the belief that she knew where she stood with people, and as Electra settled at her workstation, fritters pulsing slightly as she tried to concentrate on fabric tapes and sketches, she realized how important energy she'd spent over the once months maintaining a relationship that needed constant consolation, constant evidence of fidelity, and how strange it felt now to be beside someone who asked nothing of her except honesty, and RJ watched her still, pretending to organize his sketches while actually keeping track of the subtle signs she was unraveling again, the way her jaw tensed when horse-laugh drifted too loudly from across the room, the way her shoulders strengthened whenever someone said Will's name in a tone that carried too important curiosity, and when she eventually let out a frustrated breath and pushed her president back, RJ didn't vacillate, he simply followed her to the quieter corner near the fabric libraries, where the air felt cooler and the noise softened just enough to allow space for real discussion, and Electra leaned against the counter, pressing her triumphs flat against the face as if grounding herself, admitting in a low voice that she felt foolish for being surprised, that there had been signs she'd chosen to ignore because loving Will had felt like a choice she had to defend, and RJ heeded with the same tolerance he'd shown before, not interposing, not correcting her, just seesawing sometimes to let her know she was heard, and when she finished, when the words eventually ran out and left behind that concave pang again, he told her commodity that lodged deep in her casket, that trusting someone was enta excrescence, that believing the stylish in people didn't make her naive, it made her stalwart, and Electra blinked back gashes at that, because no bone had framed it that way ahead, because so important of the fallout had formerly begun to feel like in charge of her judgment rather than Will's choices, and in that quiet corner of the B&B shop, girdled by textures and colors staying to come commodity. Beautiful, she felt a fragile sense of confirmation begin to take root, and the day moved on in fits and thresholds, meetings she slightly flashed back, designs she revised mechanically, exchanges she smiled through while her mind replayed old moments with will through a new, enduring lens, and RJ remained there, offering small gestures that spoke volumes, a coffee placed beside her without comment, a subtle shift to block her view when she noticed two associates brooding a little too hardly, and Electra set up herself leaning into those moments further than she anticipated, counting on him in ways that felt natural rather than hopeless, and that consummation unsettled her nearly as important as it assured her, because it forced her to defy how deeply lonely she'd been indeed before the reproach broke, how frequently she'd swallowed her dubieties to keep the peace, and as the workday eventually wound down and the structure began to clear, Electra dithered at the study of going home alone, to the apartment that still held traces of Will in the form of half-forgotten things and participated recollections, and RJ noticed that vacillation incontinently, offering without pressure to walk with her, to talk, to not let the night swallow her whole, and she agreed, surprising herself with how snappily the answer came, how little she demanded to suppose about it, and as they stepped out into the evening air, the megacity buzzing vocally around them, Electra felt the weight of the day settle else, not lighter exactly, but more unevenly distributed, and they walked without a clear destination, letting the discussion wander from work to art to nonage recollections, the kind of easy exchange that felt like a adder after hours of emotional strain, and RJ participated stories about growing up in the shadow of heritage, about the pressure to live up to prospects while sculpturing out commodity that felt genuinely his, and Electra set up herself opening up in return, talking about her fear of repeating patterns, of choosing love that needed her to shrink. And as the sky darkened and streetlights flitted on, commodity implied continued to make between them a quiet closeness embedded not in magnet alone but in participated vulnerability, and when they eventually stopped walking and set up themselves moping on a quiet corner, Electra realized she didn't want the moment to end, didn't want to return yet to the reality staying behind her frontal door, and RJ sounded to smell that too, offering to stay a while longer, to keep her company, and she jounced, thankful beyond words, and they sat on a low gravestone wall, shoulders brushing sometimes, the contact subtle but electric in its restraint, and Electra aloud about how different this felt from her relationship with Will, how there was no performance then, no need to impress or assure, just two people being in the fate of verity, and she admitted vocally that part of her felt shamefaced for chancing comfort so snappily, as if grief had a specified timeline she was violating, and RJ answered with a gentle honesty that stopped her cold wave, telling her that comfort wasn't treason, that seeking warmth after being burned didn't mean she'd forgotten what hurt her, it meant she was mortal, and those words settled into her like a pledge she hadn't known she demanded, and as the night wore on, Electra allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by Will's choices, a future where she didn't have to brace herself for disappointment, and the idea was intimidating and exhilarating all at formerly, because it meant letting go of the narrative she'd cleaved to for so long, and when RJ eventually walked her to her structure and broke at the entrance, there was a moment charged with possibility, a question hanging in the air that neither of them rushed to answer, and Electra felt the appetite to reach for him again, to lean into that steady presence that had carried her through the worst day she could flash back, but she also felt the significance of pacing herself, of recognizing the complexity of what she was feeling, and RJ sounded to understand that artificially, offering her a soft smile and a memorial that he was there, that she didn't have to navigate the coming way alone, and as Electra uncorked her door and turned back to look at him one last time, she felt a strange sense of gratefulness for the pain that had led her then, not because it was justified or fair, but because it had stripped down visions and revealed commodity real in their place, and inside her apartment, as she set down her bag and eventually allowed the quiet to settle, Electra reflected on how the day had begun with desolation and ended with a fragile thread of stopgap, how Will's reproach had shattered one interpretation of her life while making space for another she hadn't known she demanded, and she knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, that there would be wrathfulness and sadness and moments of mistrustfulness still staying for her, but she also knew now that she had a choice, that she could lean into honesty, into connection that felt earned rather than forced, and as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzing with a simple communication from RJ asking if she was okay, Electra smiled through moping gashes, codifying back that she was getting there, and in that moment, wrapped in the quiet fate of a long, painful day, she understood that occasionally healing doesn't arrive as a dramatic turning point but as a series of small, steady gestures, as someone showing up again and again without asking for anything in return, and whatever the future held, whatever shape her relationship with RJ ultimately took, she knew one thing with certainty: she'd no way again mistake intensity for fidelity, or chaos for passion, because real comfort, she'd learned, felt like this, gentle, grounding, and still transformative. Morning arrived without form, slipping into Electra's apartment through the thin gap in the curtains like it was carrying the weight of everything that had changed, and she lay there for a long moment gaping at the ceiling, listing the strange sensations settling in her casket: fatigue threaded with resoluteness, sadness pleaded with a nearly inappreciable sense of relief, because for the first time since Will's reproach exploded her life, she was waking up braced for another taradiddle to face, another explanation to decode, another interpretation of reality to attune with the one she'd formerly lived, and that consummation alone felt like a quiet revolution. Indeed, if it did abolish the pang that still palpitated when she rolled onto her side and noticed the empty space beside her bed, the space that formerly represented cooperation and now stood as substantiation of a boundary she'd eventually drawn, and as she moved through her morning routine on autopilot, coffee brewing, phone buzzing with announcements she wasn't ready to read, Electra set up herself allowing about RJ in a way that surprised her, not in a romantic fantasy sense, not in the way she'd formerly obsessed over Will's attention or absence, but in a predicated, nearly reverent way, as if she were holding commodity fragile and precious in her hands and artificially knew better than to rush it. And when she arrived at B&B latterly that morning, the atmosphere felt charged with a different kind of pressure, the kind that follows reproach like an earthquake, exchanges dipping into hushed tones when she passed, eyes fluttering with sympathy or curiosity or inadequately disguised judgment, and she uncurled her shoulders and walked anyway, reminding herself that she wasn't the bone who had done commodity wrong, that surviving someone additional's treason didn't make her complicit in it, and RJ spotted her nearly incontinently, his expression softening in that way that had formerly begun to feel familiar, and he didn't rush over, didn't make a show of concern, just offered a small nod that said "I see you," and that was enough to anchor her as the day unfolded, because there were meetings she had to attend where Will's name floated implied like a ghost, designs that had to be approved, opinions that couldn't stay for her particular life to stabilize, and Electra handled it all with a countenance that surprised indeed her, fueled not by impassiveness but by a growing sense of tone respect she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. And when a coworker eventually crossed a line, offering a too precisely articulated comment about how hard this must be given everything, Electra met it with calm clarity, shutting it down without reason. And RJ watched from across the room with commodity-like pride fluttering in his eyes, because he honored strength when he saw it, especially the kind forged under pressure, and latterly, when they set up themselves alone again in the quiet hum of the design bottom. Electra admitted that she felt different, that commodity in her had shifted irrevocably, and RJ jounced, understanding without demanding elaboration, because he'd felt it too, the subtle reconfiguration of how he saw her, not as someone fragile or broken by what had happened, but as someone getting more herself in real time, and that consummation strengthened the connection between them in ways that felt both stirring and sobering, because neither of them wanted to misinterpret comfort as fortune or vulnerability as assignation, and yet the pull was inarguable, manifesting in stolen ganders and half-finished rulings and the way their exchanges dallied long after the words ran out, and as the days passed, the fallout from Will's infidelity reproach continued to ripple outward, forcing competitions and justifications and explanations Electra no longer felt indebted to accept, and she handled each commerce with the immutability that felt earned, not performative, leaning on RJ not as a bolsterer but as a collaborator in her mending, someone who walked beside her rather than ahead of her, and there were moments when the temptation to cross a line surfaced suddenly, when horselaughs stretched a second too long or a touch dallied just enough to spark mindfulness, and in those moments, Electra felt the weight of her own boundaries, the significance of recognizing the space between who she had been and who she was getting, and RJ admired that instinct fully. No way pushing, no way retreating, being in that delicate balance of presence and tolerance that allowed trust to grow organically, and one evening after a particularly long day, they set up themselves back at that same quiet corner of the megacity where they'd first allowed the world to soften around them, and Electra spoke openly about her fear of repeating old patterns, of mistaking safety for recession or intensity for love, and RJ participated his own hesitance, his mindfulness of how fluently circumstances could blur intentions, and in that honesty, commodity solidified between them a collective understanding that whatever this was, it merited care. And as the weeks stretched on, Electra began to reclaim pieces of herself that had been sidelined in her relationship with Will, rediscovering joy in her work, in her Gemütlichkeit, in the simple pleasure of moving through the world without constantly checking herself against someone different's prospects, and RJ remained a constant, occasionally at her side, occasionally giving her space, always attuned to what she demanded indeed when she was unsure herself, and the reproach that had formerly hovered to define her sluggishly lost its grip, getting a chapter rather than the whole story. And one autumn, as Electra stood before a glass fitting a model and a design she'd poured her renewed sense of tone into, she caught RJ watching her with an expression that held admiration rather than craving, respect rather than annuity, and it struck her also how different this felt from anything she'd known before, how love, or whatever was still forming, didn't have to advertise itself with chaos or demand evidence through immolation. And latterly that night, as they participated a late regale after everyone differently had gone home, the discussion drifting painlessly from trivial to profound, Electra felt ready, not for a dramatic protestation or a defining marker,